Those wheels are not wheels. They are armored pods. And the moment you clock that, everything else about this concept shifts. Full transparency up front. What you are looking at is a fictional concept generated by AI. No manufacturer, no price tag, no delivery date. Just a vision. But the ideas embedded in this design, those are very real and very worth unpacking. Because this is not a motorhome that wants to blend in. This is a motorhome that looks like it was designed by someone who spent their entire career building stealth aircraft, and then someone handed them a brief that said, "Now make it livable." Here is what we are doing today. We are going to walk the exterior, because there is a lot happening on the outside that most people will miss on first look. Then we are going inside, and based on what you can already see through that enormous panoramic section, the interior is going to be the most interesting conversation we have had on this channel in a while. Then powertrain logic. Then the verdict, where I will tell you the one thing this design gets completely right and the one thing that I think is a genuine problem. There is also something happening at the rear entry staircase on this concept that I have genuinely not seen approached this way before. I am saving that for when we get there. Let's go. The front of this concept is doing something that almost no motorhome, fictional or otherwise, has ever attempted. There are no headlights in the conventional sense. What you are seeing instead is a clustered, multifaceted glazed pod unit at the front, almost like the compound eye of an insect, but executed in obsidian black with amber accent lighting tracing the geometry. What does that communicate before this vehicle even moves? Aggression. Intentionality. The design language is saying, this does not ask permission. That is a bold brand statement for a vehicle category that has historically tried to look friendly and approachable. Someone made a very deliberate decision to go the opposite direction, and I respect the commitment even if I want to interrogate the practicality of it. For you, sitting in the driving position behind that front pod glazing, visibility is going to be a fascinating problem to solve. More on that when we hit the cockpit. Step back and look at the full silhouette and you will notice something that takes a second to register. This vehicle has almost no taper. From the front pod assembly through to the main habitable body, the roofline is essentially flat and horizontal, and the body sides are nearly vertical. In conventional vehicle design, that is considered aerodynamically inefficient. Here, it is a deliberate aesthetic statement. This concept is not pretending to be aerodynamic. It is presenting itself as a structure, like a building that happens to be on wheels. The glass-to-body ratio on that main habitation section is extraordinary. I would estimate you're looking at somewhere between 40 and 50% of the sidewall being glazed. That is not motorhome thinking. That is superyacht thinking transplanted onto land. The roofline itself is faceted, not curved, not flat, but broken into angular planes that catch light differently depending on your viewing angle. In the render lighting here, you get this beautiful shift between the pale silver-gray panels and the deeper shadow recesses of each facet join. In direct sunlight on a highway, this vehicle would look genuinely extraordinary. Now here is where I want to push back slightly on the design, because I think it is important to be honest. The faceted geometry is visually stunning, but facets at this scale create significant drag. Each panel edge junction is a turbulence generator. In a real engineering scenario, you would be looking at a meaningful range penalty compared to a more streamlined form. The designer's answer to that, I suspect, is those front corner geometry cuts. Look at how the forward body corners are chamfered at roughly 45 degrees. That is not decorative. That is a conscious attempt to manage airflow separation at the leading edges. It will not solve the drag problem entirely, but it shows there was some aerodynamic thinking happening alongside the sculptural ambition. For you traveling at highway speed in something like this, the crosswind handling would be the real conversation. That vertical sidewall is a significant sail surface. The finish is a two-tone, a matte charcoal to black across the structural framing elements and wheel assemblies, contrasted with what appears to be a satin or semi-gloss platinum silver across the main body panels. The amber LED accent lines trace every major geometry edge junction. What does this finish communicate? It is saying precision manufacturing. Matte finishes in automotive design are associated with bespoke, hand-finished surfaces. They absorb light rather than reflecting it, which actually makes panel quality more visible, not less. Any imperfection shows immediately on matte. The fact that these panels read as flawless in the render suggests a designer who understood that language. And then there are the wheels. I have to spend a moment here because these are genuinely unlike anything in the current motorhome category. These are not conventional pneumatic tire assemblies. They appear to be enclosed, armored wheel pod units, octagonal in section, heavily structured, with what looks like independent hub motor integration built directly into the pod geometry. The stance is wide, notably wide, wider than the body above it, which creates that aggressive planted look, like the vehicle is gripping the ground rather than sitting on it. What does this signal about intended use? This concept is not designed for campsite gravel paths. The wheel architecture here is communicating serious off-road capability ambition, potentially articulated independent suspension, possibly even the ability to navigate terrain that would destroy a conventional motorhome chassis. I need to get inside. Because that exterior is making promises that the interior either keeps or doesn't. Before we even discuss what is inside, let's use that exterior to do some detective work, because this is what I find genuinely fascinating about concept analysis. You can extract interior logic from exterior evidence if you know what to look for. Those wheel pod assemblies appear to be approximately 80 to 90 centimeters in diameter at their widest point. Use that as your scale reference. The main habitation body sits elevated above those wheel pods on what appears to be a raised chassis platform. That elevation gives us something precious: floor-to-ceiling height. Working from those proportions, I would estimate interior ceiling height somewhere in the range of 2.1 to 2.3 meters. That is stand up straight, arms above your head. This does not feel like a vehicle ceiling height. That changes everything about how a space feels. The single biggest psychological limitation of conventional motorhomes is that slightly too low ceiling that makes tall people feel compressed and everyone feel aware they are in a vehicle. This concept appears to have engineered that problem away. Now look at that panoramic glass section. What it reveals is not one continuous room. It is a sequenced series of zones that you can begin to map from the exterior glazing pattern. The front glazed pod unit, that complex multifaceted assembly at the front, is almost certainly the cockpit zone. Its geometry and positioning suggest a fully enclosed operator environment separated from the main living space. Behind it, the main panoramic glass runs across what I would divide into three distinct zones: a lounge zone, a transition corridor, and what appears to be a media or dining zone at the far end. Through the glass, you can clearly see a full-length sofa arrangement, low, contemporary, the kind of seating profile you would find in a private members club rather than a motorhome showroom. Above the sofa line, horizontal amber lighting strips trace the interior ceiling geometry. The warmth of that lighting against what appears to be a dark interior palette is doing serious work. This does not look like a vehicle interior. It looks like a penthouse apartment at night. Here is what it would actually feel like to be in that lounge zone. You are sitting on a low sofa, sunk slightly into the cushion. The amber lighting strips above you are warm and indirect. No harsh overhead glare. To your left, floor-to-ceiling glass gives you an uninterrupted view of whatever landscape you are parked in front of. The glass appears to run essentially from the floor line to the ceiling junction, which means your sight line from a seated position gives you horizon. Not a clipped rectangle of view, but the full panoramic sweep. That matters more than any specification. The view from your seat defines whether a space feels like a room or a cell. This concept nails it. Based on the zone proportions visible through the glass, I would place the kitchen in the mid to rear section of the main habitation body, behind the lounge zone, before the sleeping quarters. In a concept at this positioning level, the kitchen philosophy would almost certainly prioritize integration over appliance exposure. You would expect induction surfaces that disappear into the countertop when not in use, refrigeration integrated into cabinetry with no visible handles, and, critically, minimal depth counters to preserve the sense of open floor space. The storage philosophy in a kitchen like this would be vertical. Given the ceiling height advantage this concept appears to have, there is space to push storage up the walls and free the floor. That is how you make a motorhome kitchen feel like an apartment kitchen rather than a galley. The sleeping zone would logically be positioned at the rear, behind the main lounge and kitchen zones. This is the conventional motorhome layout logic, but in a concept with this footprint, it becomes genuinely interesting. Rear positioning means the sleeping zone is over the rear axle assembly, and those rear wheel pods appear to be set wide and low enough that the floor above them could conceivably be flat. A flat floor over the rear axle is not a given in motorhome design. If the designer has achieved it here, it means a full-width bed platform is achievable without the stepped subfloor compromise you see in most production vehicles. A full-width rear bed at this ceiling height, behind that panoramic glass, you would wake up in what feels like a floating room. That is not a marketing line. That is a spatial experience. Water management in a motorhome at this scale is an engineering conversation that most concept renders skip entirely, and honestly that is fine. This is imagination, not a plumbing manual. But if this were ever engineered for reality, you would be looking at a gray water holding capacity that needs to match the ambition of the interior. A concept this size, with this level of finish aspiration, demands a walk-in wet room with proper drainage, not a shower cubicle. A wet room. The technology to manage that, the pumps, the filtration, the tank architecture, exists in superyacht builds today. It would be heavy. It would require intelligent weight distribution. But it is not science fiction. And now the cockpit, which I said I would return to. That front pod assembly. Step back and look at its geometry from the side. It is angled forward, slightly downward, with multiple faceted glazing panels creating what is essentially a wraparound visual field for the operator. In a real build scenario, you would not sit behind that glass. You would sit within it. The cockpit would feel more like a fighter aircraft instrument pod than a driver's cab. Digital instrumentation embedded into the forward surfaces. No conventional dashboard, just a low-profile control surface and a panoramic view that puts the entire road ahead and both corners of the vehicle within your sightline. For a concept with wheel pods this large and this wide-set, precise low-speed maneuvering would be the real challenge. This is exactly the use case where autonomous parking logic, the vehicle handling its own positioning in tight spaces, stops being a luxury feature and becomes a functional necessity. The amber LED geometry throughout the interior does not read as decorative lighting. It reads as an integrated architectural system, the kind of lighting management you see in high-end residential builds where every zone has independent control and the lighting responds to time of day, occupancy, and ambient conditions. Pair that with predictive climate management, solar roof integration for interior system sustaining, and route-linked charging preconditioning, and you have a smart ecosystem that makes living in this concept feel less like operating a vehicle and more like living in a building that occasionally moves. If this were ever engineered for reality, the propulsion conversation would start and end with full electric. Here is why that is the only answer at this positioning level. The wheel pod architecture, those armored, enclosed wheel assemblies, is almost certainly designed around integrated hub motors. One motor per wheel. That is a four-motor, four-wheel drive system where torque vectoring happens at the individual wheel level. What that means for you in practical terms, this concept could navigate surfaces that would be completely inaccessible to a conventional motorhome drivetrain. Loose terrain. Steep gradients. Uneven surfaces that would flex a conventional chassis dangerously. Battery capacity for a vehicle of this mass and this interior ambition would need to be substantial. The closest real-world reference points are long-haul electric truck platforms. Think in the range of 400 to 600 kilowatt-hours of usable capacity. That is not a small battery. That is a battery that weighs roughly 2 to 3 tons on its own. The chassis architecture would need to be built around that weight from day one, not retrofitted. The roof geometry, with those flat faceted panels, is a natural solar integration surface. Not as a primary power source. In a vehicle this size, solar cannot meaningfully replenish driving range. But as an off-grid interior system sustainer, solar can run your climate, your lighting, your water systems, your connectivity, indefinitely in good conditions. That transforms the off-grid capability of this concept from a marketing claim into a genuinely functional proposition. Autonomous highway mode is implied by the cockpit design. The pod-style, enclosed forward glazing makes more sense for a vehicle that handles its own highway navigation than for one that requires constant manual input across a 10-hour drive. In a near-future production scenario, the operator role on long highway sections would shift from driver to supervisor, monitoring a route, not actively managing it. So where does this concept land? What it does genuinely well, and I want to be specific here, is the integration of the wheel pod architecture with the overall design language. Most concept vehicles treat the wheels as an afterthought. The body sits on top, the wheels exist beneath it, and there is a visual and philosophical disconnect between the two. This concept has unified them. The octagonal armored pod geometry of the wheels echoes the faceted panel geometry of the body. They belong to the same design vocabulary. That level of consistency across a concept this complex is genuinely impressive, and it is the first thing I would point to in a design school critique. What seems impractical, and I think it is worth being honest about this, is the front glazing pod. Those complex, multi-angled facets create optical distortion at the junctions between panels. In a stationary showroom render, that looks extraordinary. In motion, at speed, in rain, with headlight glare from oncoming traffic refracting across multiple glass angles simultaneously, that becomes a driver safety conversation that no manufacturer could ignore. The concept prioritizes the look of the cockpit over the function of the cockpit. For a design at this level of sophistication everywhere else, that feels like an unresolved problem. The most impressive single detail for me is the wheel pod stance. The width, the armored enclosure, the implied hub motor integration. That decision alone elevates this from a styling exercise to a concept with an actual use case proposition. It says, this can go places a motorhome has never been. And that is a story worth telling. The one thing I would change specifically is the entry staircase on the side. You can see it clearly, a multi-step exposed staircase that deploys from the body side. It is functional. It works. But it is the only element on this entire concept that looks like it was pulled from a conventional motorhome parts catalog. Given everything else this design is doing, that staircase deserves the same design attention as the wheel pods. An integrated, retracting entry solution, something that disappears into the body geometry when not in use, would complete the concept properly. What this signals about luxury mobility is this. The category is moving away from comfortable transport and toward relocatable architecture. This concept does not want to be a vehicle that happens to be livable. It wants to be a living environment that happens to move. That is a fundamentally different brief, and the designs that answer it seriously, like this one, are pointing towards something real even when the vehicle itself is not. It is a concept. It is fictional. It is AI-generated. And it is still one of the most resolved and visually confrontational motorhome concepts I have broken down on this channel. Now, the question I want to leave you with, because I am genuinely curious where you land on this, the wide set off-road wheel pods or a more streamlined on-road optimized stance, which would you prioritize for a concept at this level? Drop it below. I read every one. If this kind of design analysis is what you come to YouTube for, subscribing is genuinely the most efficient way to not miss the next breakdown. New concept drops regularly. See you on the next one.